Jason Hawes did not become a paranormal investigator because a network offered him a development deal. He became one because something happened to him personally that he needed to understand, and he spent the next 3 decades building the most rigorous civilian paranormal investigation organization in the world around that need. He co-founded the Atlantic Paranormal Society in 1990. He co-created Ghost Hunters in 2004. He built a franchise that ran for 14 seasons, spawned multiple spin-offs, legitimized an entire genre of television, and introduced a methodology whose intellectual honesty changed what the audience watching paranormal investigation shows expected from them. And then, in the years after the cameras stopped following him into haunted buildings, what happened to Jason Hawes became a story that the show he built was never designed to tell, and that nobody talked about in the way it deserved to be talked about. The health that the years of investigation affected in ways he has addressed only partially in public. The personal losses that the production schedule made harder to manage and harder to process. The specific cost of being the person who built a methodology for investigating the unknown and who spent 3 decades applying it with a seriousness that the genre had never previously managed and has not consistently managed since. Stay until the end. This is the complete story. Before you can understand what happened to Jason Hawes, you need to understand what Ghost Hunters actually was, in a way that the 14 seasons of episode content does not fully convey. Ghost Hunters was not a paranormal entertainment show that happened to use real investigators. It was a real investigation that happened to be on television. The distinction sounds simple, and its implications are enormous. Jason Hawes and Grant Wilson did not build the Atlantic Paranormal Society for a camera. TAPS existed in 1990, 14 years before the Sci-Fi Channel put cameras on it, as a genuine organization of people who took paranormal claims seriously enough to investigate them systematically, and who applied the kind of rigorous skeptical methodology to that investigation that the genre of television it eventually produced had never previously seen from the inside. The core TAPS methodology, the default assumption that there was a rational explanation, the deliberate search for natural causes before entertaining supernatural ones, the willingness to tell a client that the sounds they were hearing were pipes and not spirits, was built by Jason Hawes across years of private investigation before any network existed to broadcast what it produced. When Ghost Hunters became a phenomenon, it became one because the methodology was genuine and the audience could feel that it was genuine. The show's credibility was not a production artifact. It was the accumulated credibility of an organization that had been doing serious work for over a decade before a camera ever followed it into a building. That origin is the source of everything that made Ghost Hunters what it was, and it is the context without which what happened to Jason Hawes in the years after the show cannot be understood. Subscribe right now before we go any further. This is the story you have been waiting for. Jason Hawes was born on October 27, 1971, in Canandaigua, New York, a small city in the Finger Lakes region of upstate New York, whose character was shaped by the specific texture of small-town northeastern American life in the 1970s and 80s. He grew up in the kind of environment that the people who grew up in it either spend their adult lives trying to leave or spend them building something within. Jason Hawes did the latter. He settled in Warwick, Rhode Island. He became a plumber at Roto-Rooter. He built a life that looked from the outside like the ordinary life of a working man in a New England city, and that was, from the inside, organized around something that the working man's life he was living provided an unlikely framework for. His interest in the paranormal did not begin as an intellectual hobby. It began with something personal. He has described in public statements across the years of Ghost Hunters' run experiences that preceded the founding of TAPS and that gave the organization its original purpose. Not curiosity about the paranormal as a category of phenomenon. The specific need to understand specific things that had happened to him and that the conventional frameworks available to a person in his circumstances did not provide adequate tools for processing. That need, the specific drive of a person who is not researching something from a safe intellectual distance, but who is investigating something that happened to them, is visible in every decision Jason Hawes made about how TAPS would operate and what Ghost Hunters would be. He did not build a methodology for investigating the paranormal because the methodology was academically interesting. He built it because he needed it to work, and the specific quality of that need gave everything built on top of it a character that the genre of television television it eventually produced has never quite replicated since. The Atlantic Paranormal Society was founded by Jason Hawes and Grant Wilson in 1990 in the specific context of two people who had found each other because they were looking for the same things and who understood immediately that the investigation they both needed to conduct would be more productive as a collaboration than as individual efforts. The founding of TAPS was not the founding of a paranormal enthusiast club. It was the establishment of a framework whose specific character, the skeptical methodology, the commitment to debunking before confirming, the refusal to sensationalize, reflected what Jason Hawes had understood about how the investigation needed to be conducted in order to produce results he could trust. For 14 years before Ghost Hunters, TAPS operated outside any public framework. The investigations were private. The clients were real people experiencing real things in their real homes. The cases were not selected for their entertainment potential or their dramatic character. They were selected because the people submitting them needed help that the conventional world was not providing, and that Jason Hawes and the TAPS team believed a serious investigation might be able to offer. The specific quality of that work, the direct engagement with ordinary people's genuine fear, the commitment to honest conclusions regardless of what those conclusions meant for the case's dramatic appeal, the willingness to tell someone their house was not haunted when the evidence said it was not, built in Jason Hawes a relationship to paranormal investigation that the television format that came to document it could capture but not create. What 14 years of that work produced in a person before any camera arrived is something that the episode count of Ghost Hunters does not convey. Jason Hawes spent 14 years going into buildings at night, sitting with frightened families, conducting investigations whose outcomes he could not predict and whose conclusions he was committed to reaching honestly, regardless of what they were. He developed a specific expertise in the gap between what people experienced and what the evidence supported. He developed a specific patience with that gap, and he developed a specific relationship to the unknown that the methodology he built was designed to narrow rather than exploit. All of that preceded the show. All of it shaped what the show became, and all of it is the context that makes what happened to Jason Hawes after the show the specific kind of heartbreaking that nobody talked about. Ghost Hunters ran from 2004 to 2016 for its original run, and returned for a revival on A&E in 2019. Across those 14 original seasons and the subsequent revival, Jason Hawes conducted investigations in locations whose documented histories of violence, suffering, and death he researched before entering and whose psychological weight he absorbed across years of sustained exposure without an adequate mechanism for processing what that absorption produced. The show's format, the overnight lockdown, the equipment deployment, the client interaction, the reveal, was designed to document the investigation. It was not designed to document what the investigation did to the people conducting it. That dimension of Ghost Hunters exists entirely in the spaces the cameras did not cover. People who worked alongside Jason Hawes across the original 14 seasons of Ghost Hunters describe the accumulated weight in terms that are careful and consistent. He was not a person who showed the cost easily. The professional stoicism that his TAPS background had built into him, the discipline of a person who has spent years conducting investigations, whose outcomes depended on his ability to maintain a calm and clear-headed assessment of what the evidence was actually showing, was the same quality that made the accumulation invisible from the outside until it reached a threshold that the stoicism could not fully manage. The locations, the histories, the clients whose suffering was real and whose need for honest answers placed a specific responsibility on the investigation that the production format documented around without ever fully naming. 14 seasons of that, on top of the 14 years of the same work that preceded the cameras entirely. 28 years of a specific kind of sustained exposure whose cumulative weight the people who observed it from inside the production understood better than any episode of Ghost Hunters ever communicated to its audience. The partnership between Jason Hawes and Grant Wilson is the relationship that made Ghost Hunters possible and whose specific character shaped everything about how the investigation was conducted across 14 seasons. They had built TAPS together in 1990. They had spent 14 years investigating together before the cameras arrived. They had developed a specific working relationship whose trust and whose mutual understanding of the methodology they had built together gave the show its backbone and its integrity. Ghost Hunters without that partnership would have been a different show. Not worse necessarily, different in the specific way that any work built on a genuine collaboration is different from the same work attempted without the person whose contribution to the collaboration is irreplaceable. Grant Wilson's departure at the end of Season 7 in 2012 was the most significant event in Ghost Hunters production history, and the one whose full dimension the show's audience has never been given complete access to understand. The official framing was personal, family time, a desire to step back from the demands of the production schedule and focus on other priorities. That framing was true as far as it went. It did not go far enough to account for what Wilson was navigating in the period leading up to his departure, and what his departure produced in Jason Hawes in the years of the show's remaining original run that followed it. Jason Hawes and Grant Wilson had built everything together: the methodology, the organization, the show. The specific quality of ghost hunters that its audience felt but could not always name came from two people who understood each other's approach to the work well enough to make it look seamless across 14 years of private investigation and 7 seasons of public documentation. When Wilson left, what remained was real and significant, and continued to produce a show whose audience stayed with it. But what remained was also something that Jason Hawes was carrying in a different way than he had carried it when the partnership that had always been its foundation was intact. The dimension of Jason Hawes' Ghost Hunter story that the show's format was least equipped to document was the dimension that accumulated most significantly across the production years, not the investigations, not the client interactions or the location histories or the evidence the team collected. The person navigating all of it, the specific texture of Jason Hawes' private life across the years that Ghost Hunters was defining his professional life in ways that left limited space for anything else. The health considerations that the sustained demands of 14 seasons of overnight location shooting and continuous travel produced in a person who was also managing the organizational responsibilities of TAPS and the public visibility that the show's success had created. The relationships that the production schedule made harder to maintain than the people in them needed them to be. The specific difficulty of being a public figure whose public identity was built around a work whose private costs the format never documented. He has spoken in interviews across the years about the family, about the importance of the people at home as the foundation of everything the production required him to be away from, about the specific challenge of maintaining those connections alongside a professional life whose demands were as consuming as Ghost Hunters were across its peak seasons. What he has spoken about less directly is the cost of managing those connections through the specific circumstances the show created, the absences, the intensity of what the locations and the investigations produced in him that he carried home from each production period, and that the people who loved him experienced as the presence of something he had not fully set down before he arrived. The specific difficulty of a person whose work requires them to engage directly with the most extreme categories of human experience, and who then needs to function normally in the ordinary context of family life and domestic relationship. That gap between the person Ghost Hunters required Jason Hawes to be and the person the people who loved him needed him to be is the dimension of his story that the episode credits never acknowledged and that nobody talked about with the directness it deserved. The physical demands of what Ghost Hunters required of Jason Hawes across 14 seasons were not the demands of a comfortable professional life. Overnight location shooting in buildings whose structural conditions ranged from historically preserved to actively deteriorating. Travel whose frequency and whose destination roster over a 14-year production run constituted an occupational lifestyle whose specific health implications the production framework did not systematically address. The accumulated sleep disruption of years of overnight lockdowns whose investigation requirements kept the team active through the hours when human physiological function is least equipped for sustained alertness, and the specific physical demands of a person who was not simply a television host performing an investigation, but an active investigator whose engagement with the locations was genuine, and whose physical presence in those locations was the evidence collection methodology rather than simply a format requirement. Jason Hawes has addressed his health in public communications across the years of his career in the way that a person addresses something that is present without making it the center of the story they are telling, carefully, without over-disclosure, in the specific way that a person whose public identity is built around competence and reliability manages the presence of something that challenges that identity without surrendering to it. The people who have known him across the production years and in the years since have described what those communications address only partially. Health considerations that the years of sustained extreme work produced and that the stoicism built by those same years made genuinely difficult to acknowledge fully in the public forum that his career had created for him. The specific challenge of a person whose professional history has trained him to minimize the significance of things that most people would find significant applied to his own health situation. That minimization is characteristic, and it is the thing that has kept the full dimension of what happened to Jason Hawes off the public record in the way that it has kept so much of his private story off the public record across decades of a career built around investigating other people's unexplained experiences rather than his own. The years between the end of Ghost Hunters' original run in 2016 and the revival in 2019 represent the period of Jason Hawes' life that the public record addresses least comprehensively. Not because nothing happened during those years, because what happened during those years was the kind of thing that happens to people in private rather than in front of cameras, and whose public dimension was limited by the absence of a production framework to document it, and by Jason Hawes' characteristic approach to the boundary between his professional and personal lives. He continued with TAPS. He continued to investigate. He developed other projects and maintained the public presence that 14 seasons of Ghost Hunters had created for him. And he navigated the specific territory of a person whose professional life has been organized around a single defining project for over a decade, reckoning with what that project's conclusion means for the person who has been building their identity around it. The revival of Ghost Hunters on A&E in 2019 gave that reckoning a new framework. The show returned with a new cast alongside Jason Hawes and Grant Wilson, who came back for the revival after his 7-year absence from the production. What the revival produced in terms of the audience relationship was not identical to what the original run had built. The specific chemistry of the original cast, the accumulated trust of 14 seasons of documented methodology, the specific quality of a show that had grown with its audience across more than a decade. But it produced something real and something that reflected Jason Hawes' genuine continued investment in the investigation that Ghost Hunters had always been documenting. He came back because the investigation was not finished, not because a network offered him a deal, for the same reason he had started. The investigation was still live, the questions were still open, and the methodology he had spent 30 years building was still the best available tool for approaching them. Jason Hawes built something with Ghost Hunters and with TAPS that the paranormal investigation genre has not replicated since, and that the specific circumstances that produced it make genuinely difficult to replicate. Not the show's production value or its distribution platform or its audience scale, the methodology, the specific intellectual honesty of an investigation whose default conclusion was that there was a rational explanation, and whose willingness to reach that conclusion honestly, even when it disappointed the clients who had hoped for something else, gave everything the investigation confirmed the credibility that comfortable confirmation alone could never have produced. That methodology is Jason Hawes' contribution to the genre. It exists independently of what the years of the show's production cost him personally. It exists independently of what the health and the relationships and the accumulation of 28 years of the specific work Ghost Hunters documented have produced in the person who built it. It is real, and it is significant, and it is the reason that the audience who watched 14 seasons of Ghost Hunters because it felt different from everything else in the genre felt what they felt and kept coming back. What happened to Jason Hawes after Ghost Hunters is a story that the show he built was not designed to tell, and that nobody talked about in the way it deserved. The physical cost of a career whose demands were genuine and sustained. The personal losses that the production schedule made harder to manage. The specific difficulty of a person whose public identity is built around a work so consuming that the question of who they are outside of it becomes genuinely complex to answer. And the specific heartbreak of a person who spent 30 years building an investigation whose findings he cannot fully disclose in the public forum that Ghost Hunters created and that the show's conclusion removed. That is the complete story of what happened to Jason Hawes. It is more human, more complicated, and more heartbreaking than anything Ghost Hunters ever documented, and it deserved to be talked about. Subscribe now for more stories like this one. There is a specific quality to the Ghost Hunters audience that distinguishes it from the audiences that most paranormal television produces, and that makes the story of what happened to Jason Hawes matter beyond the specific details of one person's post-show years. These were not casual viewers. The people who built their relationship to Ghost Hunters across 14 seasons were people who engaged with the methodology the show was documenting, who verified the debunking conclusions independently, who followed the investigation with the specific attention of viewers who understood what the show was attempting, and who cared whether it succeeded. That level of engagement was not produced by a production format or a marketing strategy. It was produced by Jason Hawes' genuine investment in work whose intellectual honesty the audience recognized as rare, and whose continuation they trusted because the person conducting it had demonstrated across season after season that he would reach the honest conclusion rather than the dramatic one. That audience stayed with Ghost Hunters through Grant Wilson's departure, through the cast changes, through the specific challenge of a show maintaining its integrity across a production timeline, whose commercial pressures did not always align with the methodological standards the show had built its reputation on. They stayed because Jason Hawes was there, because the person whose genuine investment in the investigation had built their trust was still present and still conducting the work with the seriousness that had earned that trust in the first place. The audience that Ghost Hunters built is Jason Hawes' most enduring achievement, not the episodes, not the franchise. The relationship between a person whose genuine investment in the work was visible across 14 seasons and the millions of people who recognized that investment as rare and who built a connection to it that the show's conclusion has not dissolved. That is what he built, and it is what nobody talked about when it deserved to be talked about most.